Good evening, all. Tonight we're going to continue our considerations of Malachi by focusing on chapter 2. Now, if you remember last week, we ended with Malachi warning the priests of their pathetic effort in keeping God's word alive. They had caused it to become a formality, they had caused it to become a burden. It was something that they and the people just did because it was the right thing to do. They had failed to stay passionate, they'd failed to help bring out the joy of worshipping God, and as a result the people suffered. But as we'll see, it wasn't all the priest's fault. The people had a fair amount of blame as well. And last week we saw that God still had affection for his people, but he'd just fallen out of love with them. He'd lost his feelings for them. And it was Malachi's job to explain to the people why and how to fix it. The people and the priests copped some pretty heavy criticism, and last week I said that this week would be even worse, so I hope you have your seatbelts on. Now I want to start tonight by reiterating some of the points made last week, as chapter 2 follows on directly from what was said, and then I'm going to go into more depth in chapter 2, building up to next week's consideration when Trev looks at chapter 3. Chapter 2 and 3 flow into each other, so a lot of what we will cover tonight is building up to what will be covered in chapter 3. But before we recap, I want to take a slight step back to have a look at a few verses that describe who God is, because if we look through the Old Testament, there's a very clear God framework. And it describes him as a creator, as a father, a king, and a judge. So if we have a look here, we can see that Genesis chapter 1 and Psalm 51 verse 10 and Psalm 139 verse 13 to 14, they describe God as the creator. And this is where we came from. This is a God of where we came from. In Psalm 45 Psalm 45, 93, 96, 97 to 99, Isaiah 33 verse 22 and Malachi 1, we see God represented here as a father and a king. He's told that the Lord is king and that respect and reverence are required. And in Psalm 33 verse 22, Psalm 75 verse 7 and Psalm 96 verse 13, we see God as a judge. He's the future judge that we'll go to. We're told that he executes judgment and he will judge the world in righteousness and the people in faithfulness. I mentioned last week that Malachi 1 starts by rebuking the people and ends with Malachi's attention turned to the priests. And this is where we pick up tonight. The book of Malachi is also a prelude to silence because it marks the last time that God will speak to his people for 400 years, and we'll see a lot more about that tonight. In chapter 2, Malachi brings up a few points about who God is. He reminds them that God is he's a father, he's a master, and he should be respected. And he tells the priests that they are treating him with familiarity and contempt. Malachi 1 verse 14 says that the nations around Israel had more reverence for God than his own people did. And this was because the nations hadn't forgotten what God had done for Israel. But unfortunately Israel had forgotten. If only the nation's fear of God had rubbed off on Israel the same way as their idolatry had. The priests were bringing God into disrepute. They dishonored him and they didn't show reverence by allowing blind and crippled animals to be offered to God. The priests put the bare minimum of effort into their job because that's all it was to them. It was just a job. And God's saying that's how they were showing contempt. And in chapter 2, Malachi expands on this. And we see that the second way the priests are showing God contempt is by trying to be popular with the people. The priests were supposed to be God's messengers and should be preaching the law, but they were preaching what was popular. They were preaching what the people wanted to hear. They were man pleasers, not God preachers. And the priests ask how they're showing contempt to God in their lives. And the answer, you're giving God less than the best with sacrifice, and you're not teaching what God wants taught. You're teaching what the people want to hear. You're making a living, but you're not teaching reverence to God. You're not teaching the people to honour their king. You're not teaching the people admiration or respect. And what would be the answer if we ask God the same question? How do we show contempt to him? And only you can answer that. And the reason I bring this up is that it would be pointless to study Malachi if we didn't ask ourselves the same question that Malachi asks. We have to be so careful we don't get complacent and we don't sit here in the hall or at home and look at Malachi, then close our Bibles and not give it another thought. Malachi gives another history lesson. He starts by reminding the priests of God's covenant with Levi. Now, in the past, the Levites were still able to make a living by teaching reverence and awe for God. The priests now were more concerned with keeping their jobs by not putting the people offside. And Malachi is reminding them that it's actually possible to have both. And the reason it's possible is because of who God is. God will provide for them the same as he provided for the Levites in the past. Okay, so let's have a look at this in more detail by looking at verses 1 to 9 of chapter 2. Malachi continues to rebuke the priests for their poor leadership and their poor attitude towards sacrifices. He starts chapter 2 with a message to the priests in verse 1. And now, priests, this commandment is for you. Towards the end of chapter 1, Malachi told the priests how they'd polluted the altar with their second-rate sacrifices before turning their attention to God, who is their Father, Master and King. He was showing the nations and the priests what their faults were and what effect they had on their lives. And now Malachi is giving the priests a warning, a severe, stern warning with the aim to amend their ways because Yahweh is the great King, and we'll talk more about this towards the end. Malachi has words to the nations and the priests because it's their actions together that bring out the worst in each other. The people had gone astray because the priests had dropped the ball, and the priests had encouraged lackluster worship for fear of losing the nation and their income. And we'll see this a little later too. But it was the priests that should have remained faithful to God no matter what. And this is why Malachi has directed his message to them. He holds no punches when it comes to his rebuke of the priests. His aim is to provide a way back, and this way back has to be on God's term. And this was only fair because they were on the receiving end of the very laws that they were supposed to be preaching. In verse 2, Malachi says, "If you will not hear, and if you will not take it to heart to give glory to my name, says the Lord of hosts, I will send a curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Yes, I've cursed them already because you do not take it to heart." The word hear is the Hebrew word shama, and it means to hear intelligently with the intent of doing. And it's the doing that makes the word alive and active. Now, the problem with the priests can be broken down into 4 sections. The priests were not allowing their knowledge of God to affect them. They did not allow the knowledge of God to infiltrate their hearts and to actually put down roots. Psalm 29 verses 1 to 2 gives a good insight into this mentality. It says in verse 1, "He who is often rebuked and hardened his neck will suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when a wicked man rules, the people groan." They had become callous and unfeeling, and if they stayed like this, it would be the end of them. Number 2, the priests were not sensitive to what God required of them. They failed to recognize God's greatness. Number 3, the priests' actions indicated that they either didn't believe God existed or they hadn't come to appreciate him. And number 4, it was the priest's job to examine the sacrifice and be concerned that they fulfilled the requirements of God. The priests showed no care for God's law, so then how were the people supposed to care? What Malachi is trying to drill into the priests here is that knowledge by itself is not enough. And Jesus said this in John 4 verses 23 to 24. He says, "But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." And God's actively seeking those who have an active and a living faith, a faith that takes root in their hearts and affects their lives. Spirit and truth, in other translations there it says your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. And if we have a look at 1 Corinthians 5 verse 8, this gives us a bit of a better understanding. It says, "Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." That gives a different aspect to spirit, or part of what the spirit is. Sincerity is defined as the absence of pretense, deceit, or malice. And 1 Peter 1 describes this really well. 1 Peter 1 verse 22 says, "Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart." And I wonder how often we are like the priests. I wonder how often our community has focused on the truth part of this over the spirit or the sincerity part. Now, truth is important, and so is sincerity, but it's the combination that makes the word come alive. The priest needed to know that when a commandment comes from God, it must enter the heart before it's effective. Only then is the person a partaker or a participant of the word of God. Malachi seems to use odd language when he says that God will curse their blessings. But it makes more sense when we read about the priestly blessings that are in Numbers 6 verses 23 to 27. Numbers 6 verse 23 was directed at the people of the time, and it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the way that you shall bless the children of Israel. Say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the children of Israel, and I will bless them." This was a general blessing on the people. There's another blessing which is recorded, and the priest would recite for the people, and this focused on both the consequences of obedience and the consequences of disobedience. And this is recorded in Deuteronomy 28 verses 2 to 14, and it's this that Malachi is referring to. Deuteronomy 28 verses 2 to 14 talk about the blessings or the consequences of obedience. And in Deuteronomy 28 verse 2 it says, "All these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you because you obey the voice of God." And we can see in here that verse 3 says that they'll be blessed in the city and in the country. And verse 4, "The fruit of their body will be blessed, the produce of the ground. They'll have increased herds and cattle, and the offspring of their flocks will be blessed. Their basket and their kneading bowl, they'll be blessed when they come in, when they go out. Their enemies will be defeated and scattered. Their storehouses will be blessed. All that they set their hand to would be blessed, and the land that they were given would be blessed, and they would be established as a holy people. And the condition for this is if you keep the commandments and walk in my ways." These are the things that will happen if you keep my commandments and walk in my ways. But there's more. This continues on in verse 10. "All nations that see you, they'll know that you're called, and all nations will be afraid of you. You'll be granted plenty of goods, so you'll be a wealthy nation. The rain will come in season on the land. All the work of your hands will be blessed. You'll lend to many nations, but you'll not borrow. And you'll be made head and not tail." So in other words, you'll be above and not beneath. And the condition is if you heed the commandments and are careful to observe them. And in verse 14 it summarizes that and says, "You will not turn aside from any of the words that I command you." This chapter also outlines a list of curses for disobedience. And if you compare between the two, the scales tip firmly into the cursing column. And the curses can be broken down into the following sections. So if we look at Deuteronomy 28 verses 20 to 68, we can see from verses 20 to 24, it talks about pestilence, disease and drought. Verses 25 to 26, they will be defeated by enemies. They will suffer boils and tumours. They'll have increased crime. Their family and their property will be plundered. They'll be subject to foreign rulership. There will be war, exile and captivity, famine and starving. And then from verse 58 to 68, a recap of all the curses are there just for emphasis. And they were told that if you're not careful to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, these are the things that will happen. Israel continually got the cursing because they continued in a pattern of disobedience. And both Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 and Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 9, they call God righteous for doing this because he kept his promise to them. He said that if you don't obey me and if you're not careful to do all the words that are written in the law, then these things will happen. And they did. So God kept his promise. The priests were to pronounce blessings on the people, and in turn God would bless the land and the crops and their increase, and this would benefit the priests. God was going to turn their blessings into a curse by sending a plague which would decrease the crops and herds, and this decrease would also affect the priests as the tithe amount would then decrease as well. And if we look at number 6, we can see why this was such a big deal. Number 6 verse 27 says, "So they, the priests, shall put my name on the children of Israel, and I'll bless them." The priests were not doing this. They were not giving God's name the full glory that it deserved. So it was only fitting that the blessings should become cursed. Malachi reiterates this cursing in Deuteronomy from verse 3 in Malachi 2, which says, "I will rebuke your descendants, and I'll spread refuse or dung on your faces. And not just any refuse, the refuse that comes from one of your solemn feasts, and one will take you away with it." Now, if there was any doubt as to how contemptible God found their worship before, this should remove it. Their seed would be corrupted, it would not grow, and their harvest will suffer. There would be a famine throughout the land, and the tithes, which they weren't really doing anyway, the tithes would suffer. And God's saying, instead of accepting your sacrifice, I will take the dung from the dead beasts and I'll rub your face in it. Imagine if God felt this way about us. God has utter contempt for their priests, for their sacrifices and their worship. He just can't accept them. And this is why Malachi refers to them as your sacrifices, because God wouldn't accept them. This isn't just a symbolic saying though. This has far-reaching implications, which I'm sure wasn't lost on the priests. In sacrifices, especially around the Day of Atonement, the dung was to be taken outside the camp and burned. The offerings that were being made at this time were essentially counted as waste. And just as the sacrifices of those times were waste, so would the people of Israel be. They'd be removed from the land to become a curse, and this is exactly what happened in AD 70. Now, I thought it was best not to find a picture for this slide. I think the words paint a pretty good picture. And what Malachi is saying is that the priest should have known better. The prophet Jeremiah says in chapter 2 verse 7, "I, God, brought you into a beautiful country to eat its fruit and its goodness. But when you entered, you defiled my land. You made my heritage an abomination." Leviticus 18 verse 25 uses very similar language. In verse 25 it says, "For the land is defiled, therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon you, and the land vomits out its inhabitants." The people were making the land sick. And it's helpful, although not particularly pleasant, to think of the times that we've felt sick in our stomach. It's an all-consuming feeling. It's often only relieve by allowing the inevitable to happen. This is a warning that we must learn from as well. Just like in Malachi 1, we've been given a history lesson that we must listen to and learn from, or we run the risk of suffering the same fate. God is not interested in religion for the sake of religion. He's not interested in the bare minimum. God requires our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength. He's interested in joyful worship because we want, and he wants joyful worship because we want to give it, not because we have to or we feel obliged to. And to hit this point home to us and to the priests of that time, Malachi gives them another history lesson. Malachi talks about the Levitical priests from verses 4 to 7. If we read now Malachi 2 verse 4, it says, "Then you shall know that I have sent this commandment to you, that my covenant with Levi may continue. My covenant was with him, one of life and peace, and I gave them to him that he might fear me. So he feared me and was reverent before my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, and injustice was not found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and turned many away from iniquity. For the lips of a priest should keep knowledge, and people should seek the law from his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts." Malachi is reminding them of the covenant God made with Levi. Being a priest was an honourable position. It required the priest to be fit for work, and this makes sense when we look at the events surrounding this covenant. Exodus 32 verses 25 to 29 contains the events of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments while the people worshipped a golden calf. The Levites were chosen to be priests because they did not participate in the worship and they remained faithful to God. God made this covenant with Levi because the Levites were loyal to God on a number of occasions, and we see another one of these in Numbers 25, where the whole nation had corrupted themselves with the daughters of Moab. And in this instance, Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, zealously defended God with a javelin, and it was this act that stayed the plague currently in the land. It was then that God made a covenant of peace with the Levites and established the priesthood. Malachi references this section when he speaks of a covenant of life and peace. In Psalm 106 verses 28 to 31, we read that this act of Phinehas was counted as righteousness, and it would give him everlasting life. Both Levi and Phinehas acted in a way that showed they had reverence for God, and we can see parallels in Malachi of both the record of the golden calf in Exodus 32 and the corruption with Moab in Numbers 25. Malachi 2 verse 11 and 17, which we'll get to, show that the nation in Malachi's time had doubted that God was even with them, and as a result they became idolatrous. Israel had repeated the mistakes of Numbers 25, and we'll see that in verses 13 to 16. They'd married into the surrounding nations, and they'd done this when Nehemiah not long before had specifically told them not to. The priests of Malachi's day were so different to Levi. Levi heard the truth and lived it, but the priests in Malachi's day didn't even hear it. Leviticus 10 verse 11 and Deuteronomy 21 verse 5 and chapter 33 verse 10 says that one of the priest's duties was to teach the children of Israel all the commandments that God had spoken. And Ezra builds on this. In Ezra 1 verse 10, it says that the heart should be prepared to seek the law of God and to do it, and to teach it. And it's a common theme throughout Malachi. Learn, do, and teach. Ignorance is no excuse. Malachi constantly reiterates that knowledge alone is not good enough because we have to live by example. The truth has to be alive and active. And the priests, as we've seen in Malachi 1, were allowing unacceptable animals to be offered as a sacrifice. By doing this, they had iniquitous lips and were the cause of so many people to stumble. You might think, well, why? Why is that? And it's because they should have turned people away when they brought their imperfect sacrifices. It's a hard thing to do, but it's the right thing to do. They were supposed to know the law better than anyone else, and they were supposed to teach it. The people were supposed to look to the priests as an example, to be able to go with them with questions and to get help with sacrifices. They were supposed to tell the people who God is. It's a serious job. It's a very serious job, and they didn't take it seriously at all. Things just keep getting worse for the priests. Their actions had caused the people to stumble. And the word stumble is the Hebrew word kashal. It means to totter or waver, and it indicates that this happens due to weak legs, especially around the ankles. And the weight of the priests' inadequacies were too heavy for the people to carry, and their legs couldn't handle the weight. We're frequently warned in the New Testament about not causing others to stumble. Romans 14 verses 13 and 21 talks about it as being a serious offense. Malachi was tearing the priests down in front of the people to expose them for who they are and to show the people that the priests were causing them to stumble. With the priests now flawed and exposed, Malachi turns his attention back to the people. He's exposed the priests and he shows how they were partly to blame for the people's downfall. But now it's the people's turn, because it wasn't the priest's fault alone. Malachi addresses 5 things that showed that their belief and their behaviour were slipping. Now this theme flows through to chapter 3, and so I'll only focus on the first 2 points, but keep this in mind as we go through the rest of chapter 2, and also as Brother Trev looks at chapter 3 and 4. Number 1, mixed marriages. Now this was a big problem for the people throughout their history. Number 2, heartless divorces. We'll go into this in more detail shortly. Number 3, they doubted God. They said to him, how are we doing this? Malachi accused them of breaking a covenant. Now marriage is a covenant, and the people thought that they were innocent. Number 4, they weren't paying their tithes. And number 5, they were slanderous. So we'll consider the first 2 points when we look at Israel's infidelity. We'll read Malachi chapter 2 verse 10. For have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously with one another by profaning the covenant of the fathers? Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. For Judah has profaned the Lord's holy instruction which he loves. He has married the daughter of a foreign god. And this have you done again, covering the altar of Yahweh with tears, with weeping, and with crying. Isn't the first part of that such a great exhortation for all of us? We're all children of God. God created all of us in his image and likeness. When we see each other, we actually see the Creator. We don't need an idol because God's image is all around us. So then, why do we deal treacherously to one another? Why do we deceive or offend each other? Paul speaks about this in 1 Corinthians 8 verse 12. And he says, when you sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. And in Malachi chapter 2, we read about this treachery. In verse 11, we're told about idolatry, and in verses 14 to 16, we read about mixed marriage and divorce. The people had been told time and time again about the dangers of marrying people from the nations around them. Exodus 34, 10 to 16, Deuteronomy 7, 2 to 4, and 1 Kings 11, verses 1 to 7 are all warnings about what would happen and why to avoid it. The threat of turning to idolatry was real, and alliance with the nations around them made that threat a reality. The influence of the other nations was partly to blame for the situation that Israel found themselves in right now. When we start to look at this, we realize just how dire the situation is. The priests had not taken their responsibilities serious, and the people were repeating the mistakes of the past. Malachi again gives a history lesson. In verse 13 he says, you have done this again, covering the altar with tears, weeping and crying. The people had openly and publicly confessed the same sin for Ezra and Nehemiah and had repented. And you can read about that in Ezra 9 and Ezra 10 verses 1 to 17 and Nehemiah 10 verses 28 to 30. But now that Ezra had died and Nehemiah had returned to Babylon, the people, they'd gotten slack and become indifferent. And they did the same thing again and again and again. And it's such an amazing parallel with our own lives. We all commit sins over and over again. Some of the people who did this brought their tears and their weeping to the altar in what can only be described as a woeful lament, a phony repentance. It was done for show. They had no desire to actually change, and they would leave the temple, go home, and they'd carry on with their lives. Malachi had once again showed that this was a pattern throughout Israel's history, and in response the people said, How have we dealt treacherously with you? They were completely ignorant to what was going on, despite promising to change for Ezra and Nehemiah not all that long ago. God witnessed the way that the Israelite men in particular had treated their wives. In verse 14 it states that they had dealt treacherously with God by dealing treacherously to their wives. And it's the same principle we looked at last week. Inasmuch as you do it to the least of these my brethren, you do it to me. God had set up the covenant of marriage as a beautiful, sacred thing, a special relationship that's witnessed by him and by others. It's symbolic of the life that we are to have with Jesus Christ, and we can read about that in Ephesians chapter 5. The principle of marriage was set up from the very beginning when God created Adam and Eve, and it's when two people become one united unit to act in complete harmony with mutual love and respect for each other. This special unity is destroyed when the couple separate. The people had lost all sense of the beautiful and special relationship that was shared, and to them marriage had become a thing you just did, and it was based on impulse or desire. What was happening in Malachi's time was a cycle of marriage and divorce which broke down the beautiful and special reason for marriage and turned it into something that was common and ugly. Malachi in verse 2, he asked the priest to hear the truth, to take it on board, no matter how difficult it was to hear. They were to accept that they had done the wrong thing because, and this applies to us, if we can't accept that we do something wrong, then we have no reason to stop doing it and no reason to start doing the right thing. Now Malachi is telling the people to do the same. And think about how we'd feel if God said to us, your life is vile and you're treacherous. How would we respond to that? Well, he actually is telling us, because there are warnings all through Malachi for us to pay close attention to. God hates divorce because it invalidates his purpose for marriage. It destroys the unity that he set up, the unity that was set to exist between Christ and us. And in Matthew 19 verse 8, a bill of divorcement had been set up because of the hardness of the people's hearts. It wasn't provided as a free pass to allow divorce, it was actually set up as a way to help regulate and to restrict it. Divorce was confined to some very strict parameters, but the people were abusing it. Something that had been set up because of the hardness of their hearts was now being used as a crutch to prop up their maliciousness. It was being used to help some people gain wealth, or used to make motives appear just or good. And it was being used because that's just what they felt like doing. Think back to last week when we looked at the free will offering and the loopholes that were found around that. Again, Malachi is critical of the people's motives more than their actions. Actions can be seen, but motives are often hidden, and Malachi is calling us all out to get thinking. How can we love our God if we despise or ridicule our wives? How can we obey God if we don't obey our husbands? How can we have equity and unity with God if we can't work together? These ideas are all taken out of Ephesians chapter 5, and this is what Malachi is urging the people to consider. Being honest with ourselves, it's difficult, quite often it's painful or it's embarrassing, but it's also necessary. Because we can't grow if we don't challenge ourselves, and we can't change to be better disciples of Christ if we don't take a hammer and chisel to our rough edges. This trimming or pruning in our lives is something that should never ever stop. After all this, we come to the last verse where we see that God is weary of Israel. He was weary because of their ignorance. And we've just looked in depth at a very blunt history lesson, but the people still didn't get it. In verse 17 it says, "You have wearied God with your words." Word wearied is the word yaga. It means to cause God to gasp or to be exhausted. God is infuriated, frustrated and annoyed with his people, and their response would have wearied him even further. And you can just picture Malachi when the people say to him, "Oh, well, how have we wearied him? Oh, are you serious, Israel? Have you not listened to anything I've said? You have wearied him when you say, 'Everyone that doeth evil is good in the sight of God, and he delights in them,' or when you ask, 'Where is this God of justice?'" The people had openly declared their contempt for God in Malachi 1 verse 13. And they said, "What a weariness this is. Oh, this religion thing, it's such a drag. Do we really have to go to the temple again?" The people had lost all joy in worship. It had become a formality. And they blamed that on God. They thought God was wearing them out with hard labour because their crops didn't seem to be growing that well, their flocks weren't as fertile. They had forgotten, or more likely, they didn't even consider that it was their actions that had caused this. They were being cursed because of their disobedience, and this caused them to become even more disobedient. They had deteriorated morally and spiritually at such a rate that God was absolutely exhausted with them. He had no affection left for them, he'd lost his feelings for them, and he wouldn't speak to them again for another 400 years. The theme in verse 17 flows through to chapter 3, so I won't talk too much about that, as Trev will cover that next week. In Malachi chapter 3, God tells of how he's heard people complain harshly against him. In verse 13, he's heard people say that it's of absolutely no use to serve him. And this would have wearied him greatly. But there is hope. He's also heard in verse 16 those who have reverence for him and spoke often about his great name. And he gladly heard those, and he wrote a book of remembrance for them. So not everyone in Israel at this time was doing the wrong thing, but everyone was suffering because of those who were. It shows how our acts can affect other people around us. The people wearied God with their perverse judgment by daring to suggest that he actually secretly found their wickedness enjoyable. And we see this in Malachi 3 verses 14 to 15. They'd completely failed to understand God. They had twisted his character to suit their narrative. Well, the crops are not fruitful. We've had to work so hard. It hardly seems worth it. Well, I bet God's loving this. In the future, they would be taught to understand exactly who God is. It's important to understand this because if we don't, we could be confused into thinking that all will be forgiven. We're warned against this kind of attitude in Zephaniah 1 verse 12. It talks about this complacent attitude that Israel had, and we're warned against it. Zephaniah 1 verse 12, "And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and punish the men who are settled in complacency, who say in their heart, 'Oh, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do evil.' He won't do any of those things. It's okay. God's full of love and mercy and grace. There's nothing that we can do to isolate ourselves from him." No wonder God is exhausted with Israel. They think he favours the wicked. Now, I can't be the only one who has had a similar thought before. I'm not particularly proud of this fact, but I've looked around and I've seen wicked people who are very successful, and I've seen good people who aren't, and you think, oh, that's just not fair. But let's look at some of the Israelites' history. They'd returned from exile, they were armed with the knowledge that they are God's chosen people, saw the prosperity of the nations around them, while they struggled and lived in fear, and they thought, well, what's the point in even trying to be righteous? They'd created a perverse picture of God in their minds because he didn't deal with the wicked in the way that they thought he should. We have to be so careful because we can be like Israel. They broke God's laws and then they complain that God hasn't blessed them. They ignore his warnings and then grumble and moan that he doesn't protect them. And finally their arrogance takes form as a question. Where is the God of justice? Malachi's message to the people was that God's justice is coming. Be careful what you wish for. Let's keep this thought in mind until next week. I want to leave it here because chapter 3 expands on this in more detail. And chapter 3 and 4 explain that while God's justice is coming, he also has a wonderful purpose and a wonderful plan in store for all of us. And it'll be a nice change of pace from what we've looked at in the first 2 chapters. Throughout the Bible, we've seen God's incredible patience with his people, and in Malachi, we see God speaking to them from his heart. Malachi had to say the things he said. God was done. He'd had enough. He was exhausted and frustrated, but throughout all this, we can see that he doesn't change. He gives a few history lessons to show us all that it's because he doesn't change, and because he's amazingly patient, that he doesn't judge quickly. When we get away from God, he gets away from us, but when we return to him, he returns to us. It's a two-way relationship between God and us. Israel is like the son in the parable of the prodigal son. He collects his inheritance early and goes on his way. His father didn't go out and look for him, but when he returned home, the father ran out to meet him and welcomed him back and prepared a feast for him. He gives us all so many chances, just as he had given Israel so many chances, but ultimately his message is, you may have turned away from me, but you can still turn back. Return to me and I will return to you.